Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second session of the second day of Global Azure Norway. My name is Torstein Nikolaisen, and I'm part of the Norwegian .NET user group who are organizing this event. And I will be your host for this session. And without further ado, here's our speaker for tonight, Cathrine Wilhelmsen. The stream is yours.
Thank you so much, Torstein. And welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning into my session about data integration in Azure Synapse Analytics here at Global Azure Norway. I'm super excited to be part of this event, and I hope you're enjoying all the great sessions that we have. My name is Cathrine Wilhelmsen, or Cathrine Wilhelmsen. I work as a senior business intelligence consultant here in Norway for a company called Inmeta, where I'm also a cloud evangelist. I get to talk about Microsoft and Azure. And because I like to talk about that, because I like to do sessions like this and I blog, I've been awarded the Microsoft Data Platform MVP Award since 2015, which is very fun. You can find me on Twitter at Cathrine W, and I blog on cathrinew.net. Just please notice there's no E in the middle of my name, even though I have the American accent. That's the Scandinavian spelling, so don't go and bother that poor Catherine W with all your SQL questions. Enough about me. Let's talk about you. Now, unfortunately, I can't see any of you. You're sitting behind your screens and I'm sitting in front of my screen. Otherwise, I would have asked you to, raise your hand so I could get to know you a little bit better. But just entertain me for a little bit and just pretend that, you're one of these people that I talk about. So maybe you're working with data warehousing or big data analytics, or maybe you get to work with some of the cool, shiny new stuff like machine learning or AI. Regardless of what you do, all of these things have one thing in common, and I'm sure you can guess what it is. It's data. Data, data, data. We all need data and we want all the data. And we want this data because we want to know what has happened in the past. We want to analyze that. We might want to predict what's going to happen in the future. Or maybe we just need to figure out patterns and anomalies and detect those things. Most importantly, we want to get insights from our data. We want to understand why things happened. But to do all of that, it requires a fair amount of work to actually get the data in the shape that we want. So there are quite a few things that we need to do. We need to ingest the data or collect it, grab it, extract it, whatever term you want to use for that. We need to store it somewhere that we can access it from, our entire organization. We might have to transform the data and reshape it, or maybe we need to integrate different data sets into one shared data set. Or maybe we just need to prepare it a little bit so we can serve it to our end users. There's a lot of things that we need to do just to get started with actually getting insights. And that's where Azure Synapse Analytics comes in. So for the next 45 minutes or so, we're going to cover three main topics. First, I want to talk a little bit about Azure Synapse Analytics, what it is and what you can use it for and who should use it. Then I want to go a little bit more into the data integration side and understand when it's appropriate to use the different kinds of data integration offerings that you have. And finally, we're going to look at how you can do this. And that's the main topic for my session here today, pipelines and data flows. What are they? How do you use it? And how does it actually work in real life? So what is Azure Synapse Analytics? I think Microsoft describes it as a limitless analytics service with unmatched time to insight, which explains everything, right? It doesn't to me, at least. So I'm going to try to explain it from a slightly different perspective. Azure Synapse Analytics is an all-in-one platform for your analytical projects. And what Microsoft did was they took all of these different services and offerings that they already had, and they kind of bundled them together into one big package and rebranded that as Azure Synapse Analytics. And within this, you have all of these different offerings, and it has an effect that there are quite a few things that you can do. So you can do all these different things, but it can also be a little bit overwhelming to get started with it because you have so many possibilities now. For example, you have at the core of Azure Synapse Analytics, you have a data lake. You can use that to store all your data, structured, unstructured, or semi-structured data, file formats, all the things that you want to just get into your Azure Synapse Analytics environment so you can do work on top of that. You might want to reshape your data and transform it into a more relational format like data warehousing. And that's kind of where Azure Synapse Analytics sprung out from. It was previously called Azure SQL DW or SQL Data Warehouse. But this is only one part of the offering right now. So if you've heard that Synapse Analytics is a data warehouse, it's correct, but it's also much more than that. But at the core, you still have that SQL engine. You still have that data warehousing engine and the full SQL offering. So you can do analytics by using SQL. And this is really, really cool, in my opinion. So I can write SQL. I'm used to writing SQL. It's a language I know and that I use every day. So I can use that to actually query my data both in a data warehouse, which I could before, but also in my data lake. And that's kind of a new feature. That's one of the serverless offerings that you have. If you're coming from a different world, if you're more familiar with writing other kinds of code, or you're familiar with Spark beforehand, they also have brought in the Spark engine inside of Azure Synapse Analytics. So regardless of your background, you can now work from the same interface on the same data, but using kind of the language of your choice. So for me, who knows SQL, I can use that. If you know Python, for example, you can use that. But we can still collaborate within this platform, which is really cool. And then the final part, which is what I'm mostly focused on, it also has an offering for data integration. So you can ingest that data and transform it, and you can choose whether you want to write code or no code. In my session today, I'm going to look at the no code alternative. So Azure Synapse Analytics is also deeply integrated with other services and offerings. And this kind of completes the entire story. So you have Azure Synapse Analytics in itself and the interface that you're working with, but you probably want to do quite a lot more in your projects. So it's integrated with, for example, Azure Purview, which is the new offering for data governance and data lineage, data classification, all the things that is kind of a little bit outside of your project, but very important for everything that you do. So these two products have been tightly knit together, and they're working across the different interfaces as well. So from within Synapse, you can go and search things in Purview. And that's really cool. That kind of completes the story on having these enterprise analytics solution inside of Azure. You can use machine learning models. So if you have someone working on that, they've deployed it to Azure Machine Learning, you can use that directly in your Azure Synapse Analytics solutions as well to do those predictions and get that kind of insight that you can only get by using those models. There's also something called Azure Synapse Link, which is a direct connection to, for example, Azure Cosmos DB. So instead of having to move data from Azure Cosmos DB, which you frequently use for transactional data, instead of having to copy and ingest and move that data, you have the direct link so you can do analytics on top of that transactional data, which is, again, brilliant. You're saving time and you're getting more of those real-time analytics. And finally, of course, Power BI. Power BI is huge. It's very tightly knit with Azure Synapse Analytics. So if you're storing data in the data warehouse part of it, it's optimized behind the scenes without you really having to do anything for using that data within Power BI. And you can also view and create reports in Power BI from within the Azure Synapse Studio. So all of these things are working together to create an overall story for your entire project. And we can see that all of this is built to get people to work together and to work together in one interface instead of having to work on separate tools and separate projects and then, having conversations through another kind of platform. So you can have data engineers like myself working on integrating data and doing all of that. Data analysts who can go in and explore the data that's available, create different kind of queries and look at that data. Data scientists working with predictions, or even just data consumers can get access to go in and look at all the data that you have from within one web browser interface. That said, it can be kind of overwhelming, and there are so many things within Azure Synapse Analytics that you could have. You could have a session on each of these topics. And I've actually attended conferences that are 12 hours of Azure Synapse Analytics content. So if this is interesting to you, I'm happy to talk more about everything else after the session. But let's focus on the data integration part today, which is my favorite. Data integration in Azure Synapse Analytics is kind of split into two, and that's because of what I said earlier with, kind of pulling in those different services. So on one hand, you have all the code-first data integration, things like scripts and notebooks. So if you're coming from a world where you're used to writing a lot of SQL code, you're familiar with that, you can continue to do that. You can do all of your data transformation and integration using, SQL, stored procedures. Or if you're coming from the world where notebooks is a thing, you can also create those in Azure Synapse Analytics. Notebooks is also a very cool offering for all of us in collaborating, because we can have text and we can have code, and it's very easy to see what other people have created before your kind of step in the process. So if that's something that you're familiar with, you can continue to work with those things, and it's easy to kind of port logic between platforms and systems as well. On the other hand, there are a lot of users who are not used to writing code. Business users, business analysts, or coming from smaller enterprises or smaller companies that don't have that skill set already, but they just need to kind of get some data and shape that data the way that they want. And that's where the designer first part of Azure Synapse Analytics comes in. So this is where we're talking about pipelines and data flows for orchestrating and getting the data into your environment, and then reshaping and doing something with that data. And this is going to be our focus for the rest of this session. So data integration in Azure Synapse Analytics, pipelines and data flows. It's the title of my session. What are these things? Pipelines is for orchestrating data, so you can create your workflows, but the main part of that is for copying data, or like I said, collecting, ingesting, extracting, whatever term that you want to use for that. It's getting data from one location, moving it to somewhere else. So in my slide here, you can see we can grab something that's on a website available somewhere and copy it into our data lake. So that's what you would use a copy activity inside of a pipeline for that. The other part is, the next part of that story is when you want to transform your data. So you want to take that raw data and reshape it into, for example, a dimensional model inside your data warehouse. That's where data flows come in. So to go into a little bit more detail on that, let's start at the top. So let's start with pipelines. Like I said, pipelines are what you execute or run. You can run them manually, or you can schedule them to run automatically. And this decides your workflow. It defines what you want to do and in which order. So this is the orchestration part of the data integration story inside of Azure Synapse Analytics. I'm sure that you can think of from your own project or from other products that you've been working with, that main executable that you click play or run on, that's your pipeline. Inside of pipelines, we have activities. So activities are the individual steps that you can run. And these can be chained or they can be run in parallel. So if you have constraints that you need to do something first, like you need to copy the data before you transform it, you can define that by adding that little green arrow in there. You can also do it to handle, if any errors come up, you can handle that separately, or you can choose to run multiple things at the same time. You're in complete control of how you're kind of designing that workflow. And these activities, you have different types of activities. If you're working with copying data, you need to define data sets. Data sets represent data structures like your tables in a database. It could be a single file, or it could be a folder of files. That data set is basically just saying that this is the kind of data that we have, and this is the general structure of that. And this is what you use as an input or an output, called a sink in the solution, for your different copy and transform activities. And to actually get that data and to work with that data, you need to connect to a source or a destination. And that's where linked services come in. They work kind of like a connection string. So you define the connection information, how to authenticate, and where you specifically want to connect to. And the data sets are then connecting to the different kinds of services. One very specific kind of activity are the data flows. So they look a little bit different in the interface. You can see that on the bottom of the screen there. And this is where you can define more fine-grained logic. So instead of just copying data from one place to another, you can choose to do all of these different transformations. Maybe you need to join data together. Maybe you need to filter it, reshape it, apply some kind of logic, aggregate it. All of these different things that you would expect to find in the transformation product, you'll find within the data flows. And you can do that in multiple steps, and it's all visual. I'm going to say that this is, I think this is branded as a no-code solution, but it's more like a low-code or designer first. It does have its own expression language, so you probably need to be familiar with, some kind of code nuggets in there, but you don't have to figure out what the code is for all the different steps that you have. So it's very easy for anyone to start using and to get familiar with it. And then maybe you want to transition into code later, but you can get up and running very fast.
We have a little question if you have time for that.
Yes, of course.
So Mitesh has a question here.
Yep.
Can you copy data tasks have filters within it, or is it the basic copy task that moves data from source to target without any modifications?
So the copy data task does not have filters if you're thinking of rows of data. You can choose to filter on different files, so you can select a subset of file that you want to copy, but not if you're looking at a data set with the rows. To do that, you do need to go into the data flow transformation or to write some kind of code to filter on the rows.
Right, thank you.
Yep, I hope that answered the question. If not, interrupt me again. So once we have that pipeline and the activities within it that we've defined, we can choose when to run it. So we can choose to run it, on demand by pressing play, basically. We can choose to run it on a set schedule. So, every Monday or every day of the week at different points in time. You can choose to run it in a periodic interval, and this is where you're looking at time slices. So instead of saying, on a weekday and a specific time, you can say that for every 24 hours, we want to load the data within this time box and then load that continuously. Or you can choose to run it if a kind of event happens. So if someone creates or deletes a file in your data lake, it can pick up on that and then trigger a pipeline to handle that in some way. So it's very flexible to decide when to run these pipelines. And that said, that was kind of the theory of this. So let's hop over to our web browser, which is our development interface. So I'll switch over to my Synapse Studio. And this is what you can see on the screen here right now. So the first time you open this, now obviously I've created this resource in the Azure portal first and then jumped into that. But once you get started with this, you'll see this kind of this home page or the front page, which is where you can start doing things. This is similar to other kinds of services in Azure as well. So they're trying to tie this interface together. What you see here is kind of the different main offerings that you have within Azure Synapse Studio. So you can do things like ingest data, which is basically creating a pipeline for copying that data. You can do things like explore and analyze, which is where you can choose, you can write scripts to get your data, or you can use the built-in file explorer to preview that data. I also mentioned previously that you have a connection to Power BI, so you can go ahead and visualize that data. If you already have some Power BI data sets, you can go and create reports directly in this interface. And then maybe the most important part to start with is the Knowledge Center. So I think that's where we're going to start. Within this Knowledge Center, this is a great starting point if you're not familiar with the things that you can do within Azure Synapse Analytics. So down here, you can see that you can choose to create samples immediately, browse the gallery, or do a quick tour, which gives you a lot of pop-up boxes. The main part here for me, which I actually frequently use, is browsing this gallery to see different kind of examples of things that you can do. And this is a great way to get into what kind of data do you have, or what different parts is this, and what does it look like, especially if you're brand new to this. So here you can see that we can go ahead and actually start using some of these sample data sets. A lot of COVID and tracking data right now for obvious reasons. But you also have things like, Boston safety data, Chicago safety data, or New York taxi data. These kind of data sets that you can use to start getting to know how to do big data analytics. So if you're interested in that taxi data, for example, you can click on that and you can kind of see what the data looks like. It has a description, and then you can click on the Add Dataset button at the bottom to get a connection to that within your interface. So I'm not going to do that right now, but it's something that you can do if you want to get started fairly quickly. On the other tabs up here, we can look at different examples for notebooks. And this is if you want to do that code first or create your scripts. So in this case here, if I look at the first one, charting and Synapse Notebook, and I click on the preview for that, you can kind of see what the notebook is going to look like. So here you'll see a preview of that with some example code, with some charts, and get a nice overview of all the things that you can do by writing Python in a notebook. So a great way, again, to get started on this. We also have different Sql scripts for doing specific things. So this is also helpful if you're new to this and you're wondering, how do I actually query a Synapse pool? You can open up that and get some of these T-SQL code samples that you can basically just start exploring. And then finally, on the Pipelines tab is where we get to all the stuff that I do for a living. So this is where you can find some of the most frequently used design patterns, things like bulk copying from a database to Azure Data Explorer. Well, maybe that one's not as used, but bulk copy from a database, or doing things like down, where did it go? Here, for example. Generic type 2 slowly changing dimension. And you can see here that this is a pipeline, but it contains a data flow activity. So if you were wondering how to do type 2 slowly changing dimensions in your data warehouse, you're not really sure how that would look like in a data flow, you can just import this one and start from there. And these are also documented. So a very good place to start, and I highly recommend that you start in there and start to look at some of these examples to get up and running fairly quickly. In our demo today, however, we're going to do something slightly different. Maybe you're maybe you'll agree with me on this. I'm a little tired of COVID data. I'm not really spending that much time in New York in taxis, so I want to do something that's a little more interesting to me personally. And I like Lego. I like building things with Lego. And there is a service online called Rubricable, where you can actually go in and create your own Lego sets. You can say that I have, these 5 Lego sets. What can I build based on that? And you can get ideas and inspiration for that. It also has a full database that you can download with all the official Lego sets and all the information around that. And this is basically just a list of CSV files that are compressed right now. And you can see that we are working with some big data in this example. Probably not the right demo to show, how Azure Synapse Analytics is performant with massive amounts of data, but a little more fun to work with. But what we have here is just a set of different files. They're CSV files, but they're compressed. And what we want to do is we want to go ahead and grab these files into our data lake so we can do something else with them. And you can, if you're doing this, a similar use case like this, you can kind of think through how you would want to do that in your solution. Maybe it's super simple, or maybe it's something like I had to do previously where you had to set up, some scripts to get the data or into a file share and quite a lot of different steps. A lot of these things have been simplified within Azure Synapse Analytics. So what I want to do is I want to create a pipeline to get that data and move it into my data lake. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to right-click on a file and copy the link to that file just so I have it for later. Then I'm going to switch into my Azure Synapse Studio. And I'm going to browse back to the home page. You can see we have different pages that we can browse to here. But on the home page, I'm going to click on the ingest part just to show you how that works. And this opens up this copy data tool. I'm going to zoom in just a little bit to hopefully make that easier for you to see. So the copy data tool is like a wizard, and you can go through all the details here on your own, but I'm going to quickly show you how this works. So this says up front that you can use it to perform a one-time or a scheduled data load from 90 plus data sources. So this is where you can start looking, start seeing all the different services and data source that you can connect to. So in my case here, I'm just going to call it copy pipeline and just remove that little suffix that they added for me. Always write a description, just not in demos when you're short on time, but do it in your own projects. So when I click on next, you can see that it's guiding us through the entire process here. So the first thing that we want to do is we want to define the connection to our source. Now, I've already created this connection, so it's showing up in my data store list right here. But I can also click on create new connection if this is the first time I've done this. And this is where you can see all the different linked services or the connection strings that we can use. So you can see we can get data from Amazon, Cosmos DB, and I can scroll all the way down here. A lot of different services, things like Snowflake or Teradata, or services like Zero, if you're working with that. And all of these are configurable, so depending on the source that you have to define how to connect to that, the different kind of authentication, but pretty much everything that you want to connect to is available in here. If not, you can use something like an ODBC connector to connect to something until the team adds a specific connector for that. But in my case, I've already created this connection to that Lego file. I can show you that one. So this is where I have that base URL to the Rubricable service. And this is basically, it's available for free on a website, so I don't need to do any authentication. It's very simple to just go ahead and grab that file from that website. So that's going to be my connection. And then the next part is to go and specify the properties for the data set. So now I need to go and look at the file itself. So I'm just going to paste that one just to make sure that I don't type anything wrong in here. And we're going to look at the themes file. So the relative URL for that is themes.csv.gzip. And this means that I need to probably do something with that data set to make sure that I can look at the compressed data and so on. But for now, I'm just going to say, okay, get this file, then click on next, and that takes me to the file format settings. So like I said, right now it's a little bit confused because, it thinks it's a text file, but it's not. So I can go ahead and change that by scrolling down and setting the compression type to gzip. When I do that, you're going to see that the preview updates and it's showing me the data that I have. And I can also see that the column headers are not what I'm expecting in here. So I can go ahead and click on first row as header. And it probably doesn't pick that up correctly. So I'm just going to see if I can detect that again. It's going to just reload that data for me. Any second now, hopefully. Oh, it's always slow during demos. See if I can nudge it to do that again. I think maybe I killed it with the big data. All right, we killed it. Let's go back and try that one more time. Let's just pick another file instead, just to see if we can refresh that one. No, I think we killed it today. I'm not entirely sure why this is happening. It might be Synapse being a little bit grumpy this morning. Oh, there we go. All right, let's see if we can try that one more time. Set that to gzip with the header. There we go. Detect text format, crossing fingers. All right, there we go. Perfect. Thank you for sticking with me through this little demo glitch right here. One more time. So now we're looking at a different file, but that's fine. We can see things like the set number, the set name, the release year, and now we're looking at the different Lego sets from that service. So now we can actually go in and live preview data that is currently existing on a web server in a compressed format. And just by pointing to that, we can see the preview of that data from within that file, which is really, really cool. I don't have to download it first. I don't have to unzip it first. All of that is handled by Azure Synapse Analytics, which is very, very cool, as long as it works. Once we have that, we can go to the next step, and that's where we want to define our destination. Again, I have a connection already to the data lake that I have within my Azure Synapse Analytics workspace, and this is called Workspace Default Storage, which is fine. So I'm going to use that one, and I'm going to specify the folder path. So I've already created this Lego folder that I want to use. And then the file name, I used sets this time. So I'm going to call this sets.csv. Once I have that, I need to define the file format on the destination side. So what I'm going to do here, I'm going to use mostly the defaults, but I'm going to add the header to the file, and I'm going to choose compression type none. What that does is that during this copy activity, it's going to grab that zipped file from the website, unzip it, and then give me the raw CSV file within my data lake, which is very Very simple, actually. It's just one click for me to define what I want to do. The rest of the settings here, I'm just going to leave as default. On the settings, this is where we're looking at the copy data activity in itself. So again here, a lot of settings that maybe you had to configure it manually in the past, but in this case, just a few clicks within the interface. So I can go ahead and choose here. I'll zoom in on this one. You can do things like skip incompatible rows, skip missing files, forbidden files if you're working with a folder of files, or files with invalid names. These are grayed out now since I'm pointing to just one file. But this particular part here, skip incompatible rows. If you have ever worked with data integration in the past, and especially with flat files and text files, you're probably going to run into an issue where there's a line break that someone entered in a field, and then that line, the data flow or the data integration flow, it just kind of breaks because it gets confused. I'm expecting this to be a new column, but it's not, and then it just breaks. So in the past, I've spent a lot of time handling these kind of errors, and now all I have to do is click skip incompatible rows, and it's going to take care of that for me. I can choose to log all of that as well. So if I'm going to use my default storage again, I can go ahead and choose whether I want to log warnings or everything and where I want to log that. So let's just call this errors, for example. Again, I don't have to create a full solution to handle those things. I just have to select a few boxes and tick those in here. Performance settings, enable staging. If you click or if you hover over that one, it's going to say, do you want to copy data via an interim staging store? So this is what you want to do if you want to load into the data warehouse part. You want to kind of stage that data first. But in our case, we're kind of manually doing that by grabbing those files into our data lake. So in my case, I don't need to enable that in this case. And then the degree of copy parallelism, this is where it also informs you of something very important here. It informs you how you're going to be billed for this. Because in Azure, everything that you do has some kind of cost to it. So in this case here, it's going to use the number of DIUs times the copy duration, and then times 25 US cents. And I'm sorry, I said degree of copy parallelism, but I was talking about data integration units. So you can choose to specify those. I'm going to set this to the lowest setting, which means I'm being billed the least. We're working with tiny data here, so I can do that. If you're working with big data, you might have to scale that up or set it to auto so it can scale up for you. In my case, I always keep it at the lowest until I need to scale up to save a little bit of money. Once we've done that, it's going to show me this summary image of what we're doing. So it's going to graphically tell me that I'm going to copy some data from an HTTP location into my data lake storage. And it's showing me a couple of different properties down here, the task name for the pipeline, and then the different connection and data set names. Now, I don't really like these suffixes that it adds, so I can go ahead and change that directly in this interface just to make sure that it's a little bit easier to read. Source data set is not my favorite as well, but I'll just keep it for now to save a little bit of time. And it shows you with the source and destination as well. A little bit more info, just all the summary. Now, once all of this is done and I click next, it actually goes ahead and deploys this for me and runs it. So I can look at this, it's deploying, it's validating my runtime environment, it's creating the different data sets, the pipelines, and then finally it's running that pipeline. And everything succeeded once we figured out that little glitch earlier, which is great. Now what I can do is I can go ahead and look at the pipeline itself, or I can go and monitor. So if I click on monitor, it's just going to show me this interface here that showed me some of the other demos that I had while rehearsing this session. But the one that we looked at, it succeeded. Actually, not that one. Here we go, copy pipeline. That was the new one that we ran. So from within this interface, we can see all the things that we can kind of log and track that is also built into this product. So what we can see here is it's still loading the activity runs in here. See if that wants to show up or if Synapse is slightly grumpy today. All right, we'll come back to that. What I'm going to do instead is I'm going to switch into the other pane in here and look at the integrate page that we have. And what we can see now is that our copy pipeline has showed up because we used that wizard. It created it for us, deployed it, and now it's available from this interface. So we can look at the monitoring later. But for now, I can open up this one and see what that wizard created for us. And now we can see that we only have that one copy data activity. It's getting data from our source data set, and it's writing it into our destination data set, which I see that I actually didn't rename. My mistake there. But just one single task. And from here, I can choose to do a lot of other things. So I can add many different activities here. I can expand them all so you can see a few of them. I can go ahead and do things like maybe I already have a notebook. Maybe someone else in my project has created a notebook that I want to run after I ingest that data. So I can just drag the arrow and connect those two. I can also click on the align button here to clean it up if you're kind of pedantic on that like me. Or I can use any kind of other activity. I can add more copy data activities. I can choose to add different data flows, and we can go ahead and add some outputs. So maybe if that one fails, we're going to do something else. I'm not sure this data flow here or this workflow makes any sense, but just to show you the capabilities in here. Lots of different activities. You can run things like Azure functions from outside of Synapse Analytics. You can connect to Databricks, and you can do iteration and conditionals as well. So this is related to the question that I got earlier. If you want to, filter some data, you have a filter activity here as well that you can use to kind of use some kind of logic in that workflow. So very basic on the pipelines and the activities. And what I'm going to do, I'm just going to discard this right now because I don't want to keep those changes. I'm going to quickly show you one more pipeline that I created that goes ahead and I've set up a for each file activity so I can grab all of the different files from that rubricable service. Inside of that, it's just running a copy file for each of the files that I'm passing into that one. So I'm just going to go ahead and click on debug. You can see that I've specified the different files that we want to copy and run that one to populate our data lake. When I click on debug, it actually goes ahead and runs it, and it's going to go and grab those files. It's not just a sandbox environment or a test environment, but it's just so I can see the output within this development interface instead of having to switch into the monitoring interface that we saw earlier. So what I can see here now is that it's going in and copying all of those files for me. I can click on the input and see, what I'm actually copying here. Lots of different settings. You're going to learn to love JSON code when you're working with this. And I can also look at the details for each of these tasks. So this is similar to the preview that we had earlier. I can see that I'm copying from an HTTP source into my data lake. And all of this information that I wanted to show you in the monitoring interface earlier, we're now looking at it in the debug view instead. So I can see how much data was read, how much data was written. If I'm working with different rows inside of a database, for example, it's going to tell me how many rows I copied, how many rows were skipped, and things like it's calculating the duration, the throughput, and giving me all the details down here. This is built into the box, which is also great because I have previously spent many, many hours on building these kind of logging frameworks for myself. Now I don't have to. So all of this is available in here. And then we can switch into the data view and look at the data lake storage. I can now browse down into my Lego folder, and we can now see that I have all of these different CSV files in here. From here, I can use the interface to preview those files directly and look at the data. So this is where maybe someone else from my team comes in and looks at what's going on here. Is this file relevant to me? Does this file contain the data that I'm looking for? Or I can go ahead and create things like a new Sql script and query that data in the data lake by using Sql, or a notebook where I can use things like Python to look at that. Or I can go ahead and click on New Data Flow if I want to transform that data. I've already done that just to save a little bit of time today. So if I switch over to my develop page here, I can see the data flows that I've already created. So I have one here that I just want to show you. I'm just going to, actually, let's just collapse that one and zoom in a little bit for you here. This is a workflow where I'm taking some data from a file. I'm creating a hierarchy based on that internal file because it's pointing to a parent ID. So I'm just creating a hierarchy here and self-joining that and joining it with the Lego sets. So themes and sets, joining that, doing quite a lot of transformation here. You don't really need to look at all the details, but you can look at the final output. Just going to click on refresh. It's now going to go and read that data, apply all of that logic, and show us the output. So what I've done here is that we can see, manual control set 1 was released in 1986. Maybe some of you have it at home. And then I'm joining in the theme names here. This one wasn't very exciting. If we scroll down to here, for example, theme name, food and drink, secondary theme name, classic, town, and town. So we've just kind of created that hierarchy for us that we might want to load into some kind of data set. Again, I've already done this. I've already run it just to save a little bit of time, but we can now go back to our data view and look at our Synapse database where I've created this Lego set. So if I now go ahead and create a script, we can run that query. And let me just remove this top here. I'm going to get all of the data that we have. And we can see that this has that same shape with the set and then all the theme hierarchies that we built. So from here, another thing that I just want to point out is instead of writing things like a where clause in your SQL, you can also search for things. And maybe you can find one of my favorite Lego sets like Gandalf Arrives, which if you're curious, it looks something like this. That was kind of a whirlwind tour of what it looks like. Just to recap that quickly, I am going to show you the, there we go. Let me see. Let's reduce that one. So we have our pipeline here, one pipeline for copying all the files. I created one for running the data flow activity, which looks something like this. Obviously, I've done quite a lot of work before this session just so I had something to show you. I think in total, this took me maybe 1 or 2 hours to set up, and that was mostly figuring out what I wanted to do and the logic that I needed to do. But again, I don't have to write any code. I could go ahead and do this visually, and then for someone else who's coming in who's new, you do need to kind of look at this to understand the logic, but instead of writing code, you can see it on the screen and kind of get some help with the different branches and joins and so on. So a lot of things that you can do in Azure Synapse Analytics. Just to summarize that for you, I want to go back to the slide deck that I showed earlier to give you again that overview. So we have our pipelines. pipelines have activities that you can choose to run in parallel or sequentially. If you're copying or transforming data, you need to define the data sets and the shape of that, like we did. Some data sets were zipped and some were just pure CSV format, for example. And then you have the linked services that define where you want to connect to. So we looked at connecting to the rubricable service, to the data lake, and to that Synapse database that I had already created. And then the one thing that we didn't do was set a trigger for this. I only showed you how to debug, which basically is just an on-demand trigger of running that pipeline. But we could also schedule this to run every day if we wanted to update our data daily. That said, again, one final thing is we mostly looked at the pipelines and data flows and the basics of that today. You can also do the scripts and the notebooks. If you want to dig more into that, I'm happy to share some resources with you and some people who are way better at that part than me. Just let me know and I can share that with you. And that said, after that whirlwind tour, do we have any more questions that had popped up in the chat?
Yes, we do. You have quite a lot of questions up here.
Ooh,
so I'll start.
Not sure that's good or bad.
I think it's good. I'll start in chronological order here. So first one is from Mitesh. Does it cost more to use ADF versus going with the code approach?
ADF versus code approach. That depends what you're comparing it to when you're saying code approach. If you're within Synapse Analytics, everything has a cost and you have different cost models. In some cases, it could be more cost effective to, for example, create SQL queries and stored procedures to run things just on a server instead of having it as an ADF pipeline. But understanding the pricing model is complicated. I do have, I did a session at Microsoft Ignite a couple of years ago on Azure Data Factory pricing. So you can look at my blog if you want to look more into the details on how that works. Or email me and I can explain further.
All right. Next question. What are the authentication modes available other than anonymous?
Oh, so that completely depends on the data store or the service that you're connecting to. I was getting things from a website, so that was anonymous. You can also do things like if you're working with a REST API, you need to pass those kind of credentials. If you're connecting to a database, you can do things like SQL authentication or managed identities within Azure. It completely depends on the data store that you're connecting to. But pretty much everything is supported, and then you just need to figure out what is your preferred way of doing it.
And a related question from the same person. Can we get data through web APIs? Yes,
you can. There is a source that you can get from REST APIs, if that's what you're doing, or this is actually something that I haven't done much myself, but you can get it from all kinds of different sources, APIs, databases directly, or basically what I did was kind of just scraping files off a web server.
All right, one more from the same author. What is the capacity of a DIU?
Capacity. So DIU is kind of an abstract thing, like with everything else in Azure. It's just kind of a number that they put on a set of hardware specifications. So the capacity, I'm not sure it's been explained, at least I can't remember it, but it's basically just saying how much CPU you have available, how much memory you have, and so on. And that is being lumped into these different numbers like 2, 4, 16, and so on. I'm sure it's documented somewhere.
All right, and then we have a few more questions here from Rajashi. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly. He says he's a big fan of your explanation and he has 3 questions. First one is, in SSIS, we avoid asynchronous fully blocking transformations. Do we need to take the same approach in Synapse Analytics?
No, so that's one of the good things. In SSIS, which is an on-premises product, you had to think about the blocking things because you were constrained to the memory that you had and the CPU that you had and so on, the hardware limitations. With data flows inside of Azure Synapse Analytics and also Data Factory, what this does is it's being scaled out on a Spark cluster behind the scenes, so you can actually run things in parallel that you could not do and you still can't do within SSIS. So you're getting away of thinking of the blocking. The trade-off for that is obviously that it might be a little bit more expensive to run those big operations, but you can do it in a shorter amount of time. So you kind of have to decide where's the biggest pain point. Is it time or cost for that? But the answer is no. You can do aggregations on big data, terabytes of data, in a very short amount of time because it's being spread out on that Spark cluster and parallelized.
All right. The next question is, what would be your advice to an SSIS developer like me who wants to become an Azure data engineer?
Go to Microsoft Learn. There's an Azure Data Engineer path that will take you through all of these different things that I showed you, all the details on both Data Factory and Azure Synapse Analytics. Or if I can be shameless and self-promote, I've written a 25-part blog series on Azure Data Factory and how to get started with that. So you can go to my blog as well and start working through that one. If not, just try and take a use case that you have from SSIS and see how you would do it in this product instead. It's a great way of learning.
All right, last question then. Is there any training materials from your end on Azure Data Engineering Learning? I think you just answered that, but...
Yes, I did. Self-promotion again, 25-part blog post series going through all the bits and pieces in detail that you can work through on your own. I've written it as part of I have a full day workshop on this as well, but the blog post series is kind of like working through labs on your own whenever you have time. If not, the Microsoft Learn, the paths that they have for the certifications and exams is really good. So I highly recommend reading through that as well.
All right, I think that was the last question.
Yep.
So with that, maybe you can finish your slides.
I can do that. So there was a question yesterday as well, and I'm not sure if the person who asked that in Johan's session is here. But the question there was, do you prefer Azure Synapse or Azure Data Factory? Which one should I use? And will Synapse take over for Data Factory? And I thought that was an excellent question that I wanted to answer in this session as well. So with Azure Synapse Analytics, what I've presented in this session is showing you that it's this all-in-one platform. You can do a lot more with it than just moving data. So if you're working with those kind of projects and you're starting something new, definitely look into Azure Synapse Analytics. If you're only looking for the data integration part of copying and ingesting data between services and you want a simple way of doing that, you can look into Data Factory if you don't need everything else that the Synapse platform offers. So if you're starting from scratch, I would probably use Synapse. If you have the use case for Data Factory and you just need that one, you can pick that one. And since we had a few questions on SSIS, if you want to lift and shift SSIS and migrate from on-premises to the cloud, you still have to use Azure Data Factory. So that's also an important distinction there. Again, like I said, feel free to email me. Go to my blog, cathrinew.net/ADF will take you to that blog post series on Azure Data Factory. And all of that is also relevant for Azure Synapse Analytics and the data integration story there. So if you want to learn more, if you want to work through all the things that I showed you on your own, definitely start there. And then I've linked to all of the Microsoft Learn pathways as well. Email me if you have any questions or reach out to me on Twitter. I hope you've enjoyed the session and that you enjoy the rest of the Global Azure Norway sessions. The final thing I think a couple of others have mentioned this as well. If you want to get a learner badger badge, I think it's called, you can scan this code and go to the 30 days to learn it and get all the little fun little bits and pieces for participating in this global Azure event.
All right. Thank you very much, Cathrine, both for your session and contributing to Global Azure Norway. I found your presentation to be excellent, and it's always enjoyable to see experienced presenters present. And I think it was a really great guide to kind of getting to map out all of these technologies because they can be a bit confusing as there are both new and old concepts. So that was really great. I think we're done with this session, and I'm done also for the evening. So I would like to introduce our next, or prepare you for our next host, which is Evgeny. And there will be a session now in a few minutes. And with that, I'll say goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.